for people to turn them in, because there were folks who said, well, this might be an opportunity for me to get rid of this smelly water turtle that I've had for a lot of years. And so the Humane Society of the United States actually helped us with that and rehomed a lot of those sliders. But we do have that as another option. Used social media outlets for finding the non-invasives. So if you live in Western Montana, if you know of a pond with this species, which is going to be the snapping turtle or bullfrog, please report it to FWP so we can put it on our list to check out and maybe add to our, eradication site list. So we have used some social media and looked for some public assistance with some of those efforts. Yep, for sure.
So we are here today with Lauri
Hanauska-Brown.
I am so bad with names. I just recognized the name. That's why I was so close.
Yeah. Yep.
It's I'm a chemist and a physics, so I don't I'm not a biologist. I don't name stuff. Yeah, that's fine. So you are you're not a herpetologist, but you are part of Montana, actual Fish and Wildlife that deals with the herps of Montana, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I work for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks within the Wildlife Division. And within that division, we have a non-game management bureau. So that is the bureau that manages non-game species, those being the species that we do not hunt or fish. So in Montana, if you are not a game animal, you are not an upland game bird, you are not a predator or a fur bearer or a large carnivore, there's a variety of classifications. If you're not any of those things, you fall into the non-game species category. So we don't have a ton of reptiles in Montana like in other parts of the country, but our 10 snakes, our 4 salamanders, our frogs and toads, those are all non-game species within the state of Montana.
Awesome. So what exactly is your particular role in the actual Fish and Wildlife?
Yeah, so I actually supervised the Non-Game Management Bureau for 12 years. And we have a new non-game program lead who's getting her feet underneath her and trying to get all things figured out, non-game species. She came from a region within Montana. We just kind of drew straws on who could do this one. And I've been in the field a little bit longer than she has, and I'm a little bit more familiar with policies and some of the history. So I got the short straw, and I'm doing this with you today, which is great. But right now I'm a divisions coordinator. So I work on a little bit of elk, a little bit of CWD and deer, a little bit of, fundraising, a little bit of everything, to include helping our non-game program manage the huge number of tasks that they have to get done every day. So in Montana, within the State Wildlife Management Agency, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, we don't have specific herpetologists or a bat biologist, or somebody that specifically works on some suite of non-game species. We have more non-game biologists that are generalists and are kind of tackling the highest priority issues of the day. And so our non-game program is managed kind of centrally out of the Helena office, but we have 7 biologists scattered across the state who do work on a variety of things on any given day, be that bat conservation and thinking about controlling the spread of white nose syndrome, or it might be monitoring Coeur d'Alene salamanders and trying to get a handle on local populations, or they might be helping someone in a community with a problem flicker, or thinking about riparian restoration using beavers or some other strategy. So our non-game folks are very general in terms of having to know a little about everything, but not being species topic experts necessarily. We have a Montana Natural Heritage Program, and they are a entity of the state library, so they are not within the management agency of Montana. Within that entity or organization, they do have some folks who are very specialized at being more experts on bats or herps or birds. And so we rely on them as a data collection entity and to help us with some of the intricacies of species life history and whatnot.
Okay. How does somebody become, like, to do your job? How does somebody get there?
Right. So I started out as a biologist in Idaho, working in non-game species management. And so I have a master's degree in raptor biology, actually, where I studied northern goshawks. And once I got that, then, traveled around, did some field work. But then having that master's degree puts you in line for biologist positions in a lot of states. A master's is required. I know in some places it's not, but Montana and Idaho, it's most common to have a master's degree to fill one of the biologist roles. And then natural progression from a biologist within a state agency is to become some sort of a coordinator of sorts, which is what I am now.
Awesome. Which makes perfect sense. I mean, being a man of the sciences, I totally see why, as a biologist, you really need that extra education with a master's program.
Sure.
So your laws here, you sent me a link.
Mm-hmm.
What are your laws? Because it says limit taking of certain non-game wildlife for commercial purposes, but it really doesn't specify how many. And then you have number 3 here, the harvest of prairie rattlesnakes for commercial purposes may not be regulated under this section.
Mm-hmm.
Things like.
Yep. So as I stated before, all of the reptiles and amphibians in Montana are considered non-game species because they're not something else. They're not big game. They're not fur bearers. So they fall into that generic field of non-game species. For our commission, who sets rules on the taking of a species or a deer harvest season, you have to be a non-game species in need of management. And that's for a commission, a state rule to be put in place by the department. None of our herps are non-game species in need of management right now. So they very much fall into a unregulated category. Our commission, our Fish and Wildlife Commission, does not set any sort of take rules on any of the turtles, frogs, salamanders, lizards, etc. That rule that I sent is a state rule, so that's a state legislative code. And it was put in place some years ago to prevent the commercialization of a number of species. And all of the reptiles and amphibians fell into that rule. So they currently are protected from commercialization, which would be taking from the wild for sale to some entity. And same with, you can't in Montana take a Coeur d'Alene salamander and sell it to some pet trade facility, let's say, nor can you take that Coeur d'Alene salamander, breed it, and then sell, the young for that species. So it's just a ban on commercialization of the species as a group. It also applies to a couple other species as shown there, like pica, things that we just don't want people taking from the wild to sell. That leaves a lot of species still available for take from the wild for sale. The prairie dogs and ground squirrels, if someone wanted to collect those in Montana, so trap them from the wild and sell them, there is no law preventing that. We certainly discourage it.
Yeah.
So when the Montana legislature put that rule into place for not commercializing those species, they put that exception in for rattlesnakes so that a person can still collect from the wild rattlesnakes and sell them or their parts. So they are the only exception to that lack of commercialization for these species. The other thing that is allowed, maybe I'll say in Montana, is the collection for pet purposes, for personal possession as pets. So we do not have a law that prevents an individual from taking snapping turtles, let's say, into their home as a pet. We also have no restrictions against harvest for consumption. So we do know that there are some anglers, we would call them, that are interested in the take of spiny softshell turtles, and they can take those and consume them with no limit and no license. That is something debated within some circles of Montana.
Yeah, I haven't figured out enough of it yet. The psychological of actually keeping to understand if it actually does help out with conservation or not. Because I kind of
personal possession.
Yeah, like I don't know. So
Right.
This is something I'm working on a different studies.
Sure.
So yeah, it's interesting. Does it or doesn't it? And I'm not 100% sold on either side. And I don't know if we'll ever be there because of how different people are. So it's fascinating.
Our greatest concern is people collecting things from the wild, taking them home for some period of time, and then re-releasing them into the wild. So while I can't point to a specific, regulation that says you can't do that, we do say you can't transport or move wildlife around. So we kind of use that as that regulation that would prevent someone from taking turtles home, living in their own home aquarium with who knows what in the water and maybe what sort of disease is being exchanged, and then going back out. And we have a very large, or we're part of the large movement of not releasing pets that's popular across the states. And so we put that message out there as well. But that is our greatest concern with the collection of personal pets.
So do you guys see an uptake in that during the Januaries after Christmas and like after some of the holidays and like right before summer?
I can't say we do. I know that we have some schools that struggle to find summer homes for certain classroom pets, and so they get sent home with, a student that's interested for the summer. But we don't really have any sort of grasp on how many individual animals are collected for pet purposes. We do not believe that we have the same sort of illegal taking and commercialization as is done in some of the Southwest states with some of the, sexier species like a Gila monster. We don't really have those things up here. So we don't have things like that up here, I should say, depending on what your, what the appeal level is of a shorthorn lizard or something. But we don't believe that we have any sort of illegal commercial activity in any sort of great number up here.
I will admit I am a lizard guy and I'm not big on snakes, but it's like, Gila monster actually sounds interesting to me. I just don't know if the venomous is worth it.
Right.
I'm like still debating that, and it's like, I don't know, but that's a long ways off if I ever do that.
Right. And we don't discourage folks from getting into conservation, and if taking a shorthorn lizard home as a pet gets them more interested and more information, and they kind of learn more about the life history, that's okay. An individual lizard or frog taken home here or there doesn't have population impacts, but it is that families can grow tired of pets, and then the question is, what do you do with it afterwards? And these things live a long time, as you know. So we've seen it. I've heard it over so many interviews on some of the better people in the hobby that it just literally started as a kid. So there really is something to educating any way you can for a child. Sure.
But what about an adult?
Right.
That's where I think we see this disconnect.
Right.
And I think that we're not understanding that correctly.
Right.
But re-releasing them and back into the wild and stuff, I see an uptake on Facebook groups and stuff right after Christmas, right after, Easter, and right at the beginning of summer, like right as the school starts and the beginning of summer starts, these big events often lead to people dropping off their animals.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I'd like to see that kind of go the way of the dodo.
Yeah. So I maybe should comment that a number of years ago, we changed the classification of the red-eared slider to prohibited in Montana. So that is another rule I didn't send you. We have a classification review committee here that looks at people's desire to bring a new pet into the state, or maybe we have a concern about pets that are existing in the state that we want to make sure don't get out. And so one way that we can limit what comes in is to classify a species as prohibited. And we knew we had a problem with red-eared sliders in western Montana. We believe all of the populations that we do have are from pet releases. So we classified those guys as prohibited to make sure that no more came in, and so that we had some sort of teeth behind a rule that would be there if we caught someone maybe releasing them, more than once. We don't want to criminalize people trying to do the right thing, but we do need some stick behind our regulations. And in that instance, we had a large number of people that didn't want to be in possession of something that was technically illegal, although we were not going door to door taking people's red-eared sliders. But we did have to design a program for people to turn them in, because there were folks who said, well, this might be an opportunity for me to get rid of this smelly water turtle that I've had for a lot of years. And so the Humane Society of the United States actually helped us with that and rehomed a lot of those sliders. But we do have that as another option in our toolbox, and we are currently trying to prohibit the importation for pet trade of any of the salamanders not native to Montana due to obvious disease concerns.
I love what you just said there, because I think most of the problems that we have in herbiculture are actually problems period in the world. They're not just localized to herbiculture. Sure. And because gun buybacks work. Yeah. So animal buybacks should work too. That actually makes perfect sense. Yeah. And to keep them out of the gutters and stuff, so we can actually help them better. Right. I really like that idea. That's very interesting. Something I really didn't think of before. The people in the United States, once again, we need to look at a bigger, broad spectrum of how things work. Not just, we think this works this way, but how does it really work? In the United States and Canada, people run into buildings all the time with cars. It's actually a lot more common than we want to believe. What Denmark did was recognize the problem as we are just simple. Like, it's just, we don't have anything that's telling us to slow down in our brains, so we just don't register that something's about to happen. So what they did is actually shrink their roads and made them a little curvier. Oh yeah. And they almost have no accidents where people hit houses. Yeah. And it's like, that's a perfect plan to me. Like, if we could situate that, so doing something like a licensing to own any animal, any exotic, where you just take this basic test. And it's okay if you don't really register everything afterwards. It's not meant to be that. It's meant to be what school's really meant to be, is to help you later be able to understand how to take care of the animals better, such like humidity, surface versus air temperature, Ferguson zones, things like that. Things just you should know before you own a bearded dragon. Right, right. And it's like, I know tons of people that don't know how to read a light bulb, so that would be one of them. And we do have that for any of the controlled species, and I can send you that list. For a controlled species permit in the state of Montana, you do have to have a license, and there's some reporting required. So we have a number of non-controlled species. Those are going to be your reptiles and amphibians that you can buy at the pet store, that are broadly for sale, broadly owned. But if you want something a little unique that, maybe you're bringing
bringing with you from another state, or you're ordering from some other place, and it's not one of those very standard pet store animals, you may have to get a controlled species permit, and then there's some tracking, at least, of those. So we can tell you where we have, some of the more unique herps in Montana in terms of ownership. So in Montana, there are 3 classifications. There are prohibited, like I said, if there's something super dangerous or something that poses great risk to native species or humans, we can make those prohibited, meaning you may not bring them in unless you are the owner of a AZA classified zoo, let's say, but a standard citizen could not own A, B, or C. Then we have non-controlled, which again are going to be those species that are very commonly obtained at a pet store, and then controlled are the species that we keep a bit tighter grip on and a tighter tracking system. And so those, again, are going to be the species that, may be a bit more dangerous to humans or the environment, and therefore we're not broadly saying everyone should or could have one.
Yeah, if you're doing it as a reasonable, then there's no reason why, it's not like, oh, well, I have to jump to 1,000 hoops to get this one thing. I just have to do this little extra. Okay, fine. I have to do that with my allergy pills, and I'm fine with it when that, it's like I'll stand in line for an extra 5 minutes and register to do it. I'm fine with that. But when it's like, no, you had to go see a doctor, you do all these things like this, it's like, I've already been diagnosed. I've already had all this. I don't need that. Right. Yeah, it's interesting. So I'll leave the link in below of that. Send me some of the other stuff you were talking about. I appreciate it.
Yep.
So you did already talk about what you were working on, which is really important stuff. Diseases we don't take enough note of. Mm-hmm. I did a small survey of quarantine, and I was very disappointed. Do you keep anything personally? Do you have any reptiles or amphibians that you keep?
I do not. We were one of those households, though, that had a leopard gecko for a couple of years when, our daughter was into that sort of thing. So we gave it a shot. It lost its shine after a while, and we were fortunate enough to find another young individual who was very excited to have it and had a plethora of other reptiles that it fit right in with.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of those things you got to let the kids try, but it was not meant to be long term.
Okay. So the conservation of your state, let's talk about that. What are some of the takeaways that we should have with the conservation of Montana?
Yeah, for reptiles and amphibians, most of our efforts right now are in survey and inventory. And that is because we don't know a whole lot about some of these species. Some species, let's say smooth green snake, we have just a tiny piece of its range. So we don't spend a whole lot of time putting a lot of dots on the map as to where that species is found. However, we know it's there. We report observations of it. We talk about whether it should be a priority for survey and inventory. Unfortunately, with some of these species that aren't as popular as the bigger stuff in the western states, we don't get a lot of resources to survey or do any conservation work until there is a federal petition to list them as a threatened or endangered species. Not true for any of the reptiles or amphibians right now. Northern leopard frogs were petitioned some years ago. We were in the midst of a monitoring program where we could demonstrate, actually, there's a lot of leopard frogs in eastern Montana in historical sites, not as many in western Montana. At that point, some of our tribal partners expressed an interest and started a program of moving eggs from a site in eastern Montana to further west, and they have initiated some new breeding populations of northern leopard frogs. So that is one project that our partners have been very involved with. And again, that's a tribally led effort. We are in the midst of a survey for Coeur d'Alene salamanders because we have some concerns that their habitats are very unique, very individual. and they are most likely very vulnerable to any sort of change in climate or road construction in some cases, because they may be inhabiting seeps along a highway, and they're not something you see as a highway contractor, perhaps, but they are there. And so we need to know where those things are so we can conserve those habitats, or maybe in some cases move them out of the way until some temporary construction project is finished. One of our larger conservation efforts, I would say, in Montana right now is just an attempt at controlling non-invasives. In Western Montana, while we don't have genetic evidence that these snapping turtles are not supposed to be there, we are 99.9% positive that snapping turtles do not belong west of the Continental Divide. And we believe we have some evidence that some of that presence has occurred through bucket biology, so people moving things around. We know that snapping turtles can eat a lot of native amphibians. They eat a lot of native birds. They can eat a lot of native anything. And they, along with the bullfrogs, are our greatest conservation concern right now in the western part of the state. So we have had some eradication efforts. It is extremely difficult. It is extremely time consuming. We have no misconception that we will be removing the species entirely anytime soon, but we are very concerned about particular water bodies that we're trying to keep them out of. And so bullfrogs in particular, we're trying to limit their spread into new areas. And snapping turtles are a little bit easier to think about eradicating because they are found in some cases in smaller, more isolated ponds. And so we're working with landowners, maybe homeowners associations, watershed groups, to educate them on the damage that these non-natives can do, and what we can be doing to prevent further spread and trying to control them. So those would be the probably greatest conservation programs for native species right now. But along with that, we've been doing some surveys for shorthorn lizards and other things across the state, just to try to get a more accurate read on where we have things, and to some extent, what their habitat looks like, what they may be threatened with, so that we have some more information as to maybe what else we could be doing.
Yeah, because by the time you recognize that there's a problem, they've probably already established, especially like a snapping turtle, since they hide so much under the water. And then somebody once, we were talking about captive wild populations and stuff. I was talking to a rescue. They're awesome Three Sisters rescue here in Missouri. And they were talking, the lady's just brilliant, and she was talking about how most likely the ones that we catch are not the healthiest, because that's the easier ones to catch, the ones that are not the healthiest.
Yeah, I cannot comment on that.
Yeah, it's so the healthier ones are the ones that are hiding,
right?
And so they're the ones that are going to actually give more babies. And yeah, it's interesting how that.
We know the
works.
smarter ones are harder to catch. Once you begin a bullfrog eradication program in a location, it gets very, very difficult, because they acclimate to either any means of capture or lethal take that you try to use.
Which I've actually heard from lots of different things, like crocodiles and alligators and lots of actual reptiles do that. They adapt to the actual catching of them and the eradication of them to preserve themselves. I mean, it makes sense, but it's quite fascinating. And most people just see them as dumb animals, and it's like, that's not a dumb animal thing. That's just it's fascinating how that works. Having people call in is often what other states do, to say that we found this animal at this spot and this is what it looks like and stuff. Do you guys have that programs as well?
We have in the past used some social media efforts at obtaining greater shorthorn lizard observations. We, over the past number of years, have tried to design a survey for those guys that would lead us to a place where we could say, we feel confident that we have enough information to say the greater shorthorn lizard population distribution is here, and it appears, well distributed and healthy, whatever you can say about a population after you've maybe seen enough or not found enough. The other side of that is to say, we have surveyed this many years, this many locations with this technique. We don't think there's any here left at all. We attempted to design a survey that got us to one of those points, probably the former, that the population is secure, but they have proven to be notoriously difficult to survey. So we know that in the fall or late summer in particular, we have a lot of boots on the ground in habitats where greater shorthorn lizards are, and a lot of those hunters are going to be mule deer hunters or maybe pronghorn hunters, and they're on the landscape and they're looking at their feet on occasion, or they're sitting down. And we were relatively successful, I'll say pleased, at the number of reports we got from folks on the ground at that time of year that reported shorthorn lizards. So we kind of continue that, but that was just a hunters in the field. Tell us if you see one of these guys, and they're pretty easy to distinguish from others. There's not a lot of a lot of risk of mistaken ID. So we did use, recreationists for that. We have also used social media outlets for finding the non-invasives. So if you live in Western Montana, if you know of a pond with this species, which is going to be the snapping turtle or bullfrog, please report it to FWP so we can put it on our list to check out and maybe add to our, eradication site list. So we have used some social media and looked for some public assistance with some of those efforts. Yep, for sure.
So is there anything that anybody can do to help you guys out with conservation in Montana?
Yeah, so we've, we've thought about different things, for different ways for the public to help us with removal of invasive species in particular. And that always comes with some risk of mistaken ID. We wouldn't want someone who thought they were killing bullfrogs to actually be killing something native. And there's some distastefulness of trying to eradicate species as well. And so we do hear some pushback on that, we should leave the species alone wherever they're at. So we're careful in our efforts right now to involve the public in removal or eradication efforts for invasive species.
Because the other side of that is what some people did in Florida was they would, like, if they caught a wild tagu, they would send it into the pet trade out of state.
Oh.
And so these are some of the things that it's not so, if people are like, this is really bad, mm-hmm. I don't know. Like, it's one of those things to think about, because there are places in the United States where snapping turtles are native.
Correct. So, they're actually native in the eastern side of Montana. Yep.
Could climate change be causing the shift as well?
It might be making habitats more suitable for some of these species. We do not believe the species are getting there on their own, though. The continental divide is a pretty significant barrier for something that moves at the speed of a bullfrog or a snapping turtle. And so it is more than likely that those things got to the west side in a bucket or a tank of some sort.
I've heard of the continental divide, but I don't know exactly what it is off the top of my head.
So it's just a mountain range that goes from Canada all the way down to Mexico and basically splits the western watershed of the United States from the east. So it is a significant, 5 to 7, 8, 9, 10,000 foot barrier. Yeah. Somehow
they're making it over that. It's weird.
They're not getting there via a waterway. So it is questionable, but our conservation that the public can help us with, we try to educate folks on living with wildlife, and we have some decent materials online. Our Department of Agriculture has a very skilled individual also who does lots of trainings and has a great interest in snake conservation in general, when we can move rattlesnakes instead of killing rattlesnakes, and when we can avoid a hibernacula instead of removing the whole thing. So we work with them, and we do a lot of that education work when possible with the public, so that if they have a temporary, maybe a short time sort of conflict, if they can let it sit. But, I've found myself in situations where people were really in tight spots with old houses full of, snake hibernacula in the basement that they weren't aware of. And those sorts of things sometimes have to be handled in a bit more heavy-handed manner. But we do certainly work most closely with the public, and just, letting wild creatures have their space, and reminding folks that in particular with the snakes, that they're a good rodent control, good pest monitor or management team. So we encourage that. But, in general, for reptiles and amphibians, it's about keeping poisonous things out of the water, keeping habitats healthy, not releasing non-invasives, and giving animals some space.
Yeah, I notice a lot more people, like at my work, I'm so well known for reptiles that they've actually nicknamed me the lizard. A lot of people have.
Nah.
My guard shack at work knows me as the lizard. Hey, it's the lizard.
Yeah.
And literally multiple people have actually told me, they said, dude, I thought about catching this lizard for you. And they're like, no, because it eats the bugs and lives in my walls.
Yeah, right.
I'm like, that's good. Like, it's like, we're fine with that. It's like, I love that. Like, that hearing that little bit of feedback, I feel like I'm doing something right.
Yeah. Some days it's all you get, and that's good enough.
Take the small victories when you can.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, how do you get a law passed? And we know the laws probably definitely come across your desk, don't they, before they get.
Yeah, and they come across someone's desk. Yep.
Okay. How do laws get passed in Montana?
Yeah, so it's interesting. A law that goes through the legislature, so the legislative system would be introduced to the legislative body every other year. We're about to enter a legislative process, legislative session right now, starting next week. So that's one of those state codes, a Montana code annotated. But then there are the rules that the commission can pass as well. So there's kind of a two-tiered approach. We do have some folks, I believe, exploring some regulation on the take of snapping and spiny softshell turtles in general, because there are in some places of the state, in certain waterways, interested constituent group that is catching for food some of these turtles. Because we don't have any current regulation on that, we have no way to track how many people might be doing that or how many individual animals they might be taking. And therefore, there are a couple of interested entities that have approached me a few times now. How do we change that and get a rule on the books? And we can do that a couple different ways. There could be a legislative rule put in place, or we could possibly do it through commission. It gets a little messy depending on the species classification, who gets the authority to make what rule. But it either has to go through one of those two entities, the legislative body or the Fish and Wildlife Commission. So those are... That's really the biggest rule that we've heard any rumors of in the last few years, is just some sort of regulated take on the reptiles for food. And again, it's just the turtle species. Which,
I can't tell people like that reptiles can't be eaten. I mean, it's one of those things that they eat savanna monitors in West Africa. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an actual thing that happens.
Sure.
And I mean, as humans, we need food too. So I can't say that's bad or good, because it's like I was talking about before, what actually works best? Because not everything works best.
Right.
So it's trying to figure that out and trying to do the studies. You'd be amazed at how many studies I cannot find on bans, period. Travel bans, animal bans, any type of ban at all. And I just can't find any study on it. and it's fascinating. So how well do those work?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, my takeaway is from what I've seen over my years is that when we moved from our the gas that was in air conditioning units for cars and stuff, that was creating the hole in the ozone layer, and we changed to a new one. People didn't lose air conditioning in their cars. It lowered, so they complained, but they still had it. So even though they complained, they weren't boycotting it or anything, because it was still there, still available. So they accepted the solution. Whereas, let's take the biodegradable potato chip bags that they had a few years back, that they were like, no, we don't want this because it's too loud. Literally too loud. So we don't want a better biodegradable bag because it was too loud. It makes you wonder if the companies did it on their own to make it too loud, or did they actually it's a good question, but it shows that bans can work if the public already accepts the solution.
Well, the argument I think we can make for regulating take of something like snapping turtles by anglers is that they are regulated for everything else. And so anglers, hunters in general, are used to being regulated to some extent. You can't harvest as many elk as you want. You can't harvest as many brown trout as you want. And so the argument is that we're simply adding a couple more species. And again, it would be a way to get a handle on how many people actually are harvesting these things. And to some extent, when we pay attention and we regulate things, we give them a little more value. Right now, it could be perceived that snapping turtles really don't matter and they're not very valuable, so go ahead and take as many as you want. FWP doesn't really care, which is not the case. We just haven't gone the route of regulation for those species yet.
But a regulation necessarily isn't a ban.
Right. It's not a ban.
It's just about here too. Yeah.
Yep. So there's a difference. I don't see us ever ceasing the collection of snapping turtles in general if folks want to consume them. But again, we have no way to find out how many are being taken a year, because no one has to buy a permit or a license, and so we can't ask them at the end of the year, how many did you actually take? What size were they? That's a way to collect information on populations that are harvested. How big was it? Can we collect a tooth? Could you measure the shell? There's a lot of information we could get from anglers actually taking these things that might help with population management.
I'm here in Missouri, so therefore our conservation's taken seriously here. So I've never heard a hunter go, I went out and I registered and I went and did all these things I'm supposed to do. It's the non-hunters that might actually be more of the issue here in Missouri. The people that are not as conservational savvy. And it's interesting. And because there's not enough funding in what you do. There really isn't. And it doesn't matter what state it is. Missouri, since we actually have tax directly for that, it's really something else. I don't know. It's always interesting to see the different versions of everything. Do you find it hard to work with a whole nother organization to do what you do? Because you said that you don't necessarily work with the herps yourselves. You have another organization that does that?
Right. So it's a kind of a combination. We do a lot of the monitoring on our own. So the biologists that I mentioned that work for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks do a lot of the monitoring for the non-game species. Often the Natural Heritage Program is contracted by another entity, let's say the Forest Service, and they have a particular desire for a particular area to be monitored for species A, B, or C. But no, we work hand in hand with our Natural Heritage Program every day, and and we're constantly talking about, what their funding needs are, what their priorities are, and vice versa. And so it's been a easy relationship. In a lot of states, and I don't know about Missouri, the Natural Heritage Program is part of the state management agency. In some states like ours, it is just not. And so there can be a bit of a difference there, or a rub, because we can sometimes have some competing priorities. But for the most part, it's a really easy working relationship. And in some extent, or some instances, it's really helpful. And I'll say that when we first started working with our caving community to look at bat populations, we played different roles. I play, and the Forest Service plays a role that has some sort of legal regulation within their mandate. The Heritage Program is simply about monitoring and information management. And so they could play that role of, we have no regulatory authority here. We just kind of want to know what you've got for information. And so we can build relationships on some of that. Some folks want to work with the state and some folks don't. And so if they prefer to work with Heritage Program and talk about species and where things are at, that's fine. And so we've managed to work that out well, and that we each have slightly different roles, but those are clear and complementary. And we have few issues working with the Heritage Program being outside. And I was going to show you this. I don't know if you've seen this. This Amphibians and Reptiles of Montana book is a really good one. And it's actually one of the two of the major authors are Heritage Program staff, or have been Heritage Program staff. So again, it's an example of Heritage Program having the ability, because of their slightly different mandate, to invest in some more expertise than we do. We would love to have a herpetologist, for the record. Again, it comes down to resources. We don't really have
enough money. Yeah,
the resources. Yeah.
There's a lot of states that do that. That actually, it's a lot more than I thought there would be. And it's kind of surprising some of the states that actually don't have a herpetologist, or some that just had to hire a new one. And it's quite fascinating to think about how that actually works. I will be getting a hold of Heritage Foundation. Okay. After I'm done with you guys, with like the FW, the Fish and Wildlife people of the states, herpetologists and stuff like that. I'm going to try to get a hold of like the social societies, herpetocultures of the states themselves, and like the Heritage Program and actual wildlife rescues. I think those are highly understated. Rescues themselves are highly understated. I don't think people understand enough. But the wildlife rescues are not the same as a rescue. So we'll be interviewing those. I don't know when, but that's my next goal after this, so we can get more information.
Sure.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you have that you want to say? Or any questions?
No, I applaud your efforts, Daniel. I think that the more people know, the better off we all are. And so for maybe the folks who do find us online, and if they learn even a little bit about conservation, that's great. So I appreciate your efforts.
If we save one animal, it's worth it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So good luck to you, and I will send you some follow-up information.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Yes. And thank you for coming on and actually spending your day with me a little bit.
Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.